The dream always started the same way. He was standing at the edge of a sea that had no business being there, suspended above the root lattice of a colossal tree, a living architecture so enormous that its bark lines resembled the contour maps of continents. The water wasn't falling. It hung, still and green gold, as if someone had paused the universe mid-exhale. And somewhere beneath it, in the cathedral dark between the roots, something vast and patient was waiting to be born again. Ren Saklara woke up on a cot that smelled of machine oil and cold metal, and lay still for a moment with his eyes open, letting the dream drain away like water through a cracked hull. The bunk above him was empty. It had been empty for 11 months. He'd stopped pretending. That bothered him less than it did about 4 months ago. He was 26 years old, rated Class 3 Xenobiological Combat Specialist by the Hegemony Defense Corps, and currently assigned to Outpost Kareth, a listening post drilled into the frozen shoulder of an asteroid that nobody had bothered to name, orbiting a star that barely deserved the title. The posting was, in the polite bureaucratic language of his assignment papers, a strategic observation point. In the language of everyone who'd ever served there, it was the kind of place they sent soldiers who'd done something wrong, but nothing quite wrong enough to justify a court-martial. Ren didn't remember doing anything wrong. He remembered doing something that nobody else had been willing to do, which perhaps amounted to the same thing. He sat up, pressed both palms against his eyes, and listened to the outpost breathe. Kareth Station had 17 personnel, 16 now, counting from yesterday. Sergeant Amara Cole had finished her rotation and shipped out on the resupply drone before Ren woke up. She'd left a half-full flask of fermented millet spirit on the small folding table beside his cot, with a note that read, "Don't waste it on the asteroid." He picked up the flask, turned it in his fingers, and did not drink. He put the flask in his left breast pocket and went to check on the signal array. The array room was the coldest chamber in the station. A narrow corridor of monitoring terminals and receiver dishes that faced the void through a reinforced viewport, 3 centimeters thick. The asteroid's rotation brought a particular swath of deep space into view once every 91 minutes. For the past 6 weeks, that swath had been producing anomalous readings, not transmissions, not navigational beacons. Something older and more deliberate, patterns nested inside the background radiation of the star field itself, like messages encoded in static. Ren's superior officer, Commander Issa Tavalek, had filed the initial report 14 weeks ago. Hegemony Intelligence had responded in 11 days, which was fast, relatively speaking. And the response had said, essentially, keep watching and don't do anything dramatic. Ren had been watching ever since. He was very good at watching. It was one of the few things he was unambiguously good at. He settled into the primary monitoring chair, pulled up the overnight capture files, and began to read. For the first 20 minutes, there was nothing. Then, in a file timestamped 03744 station time, there was something. He sat forward. The pattern in the signal had resolved into something he could almost recognize. Not language, nothing so crude as language, it was closer to geometry. A series of interlocking arcs that described, when rendered three-dimensionally by the analysis software, a shape that Ren's brain kept trying to interpret as a creature's ribcage seen from below. A cage, an enclosure, something meant to contain. He ran the enhancement protocol twice. The shape held. He pulled up the xenobiological databases. All 3 tiers, including the restricted access material, that theoretically required a level 5 clearance to view, and that Ren accessed with a 6-digit code that Sergeant Cole had given him on his 2nd week at the station, with a specific instruction not to tell anyone she'd given it to him. He ran the shape against every cataloged structure from every alien species the Hegemony had encountered in its 240-year history of expansion. No matches. Which meant it was something new, or something old that had never been cataloged. Neither option was comforting. He filed his own report at 06 station time, marked it priority amber, and sent it up the chain. Then he went to the small galley, made a cup of what the station's fabricator optimistically called coffee, and drank it standing at the viewport, watching the stars. The response came in 47 minutes. That was very fast. That was, in Ren's experience, the kind of fast that meant someone had been waiting. The message was not from intelligence. It was from a department he'd never heard of. The Hegemony Office of Xenic Interface, operating under direct authority of the Admiralty Council. The message said that his signal capture had been cross-referenced with 17 similar reports filed from other deep observation stations across a 6-light-year corridor. It said that Ren was to be transferred effective immediately to Hegemony Cruiser, Endurance Absolute, currently en route to his position. It said that this transfer was not optional. It said that he should bring everything he had on the signal pattern, and nothing else. The last line of the message said, "You've seen the cage. Now come meet what was inside it." He read that line 3 times. Then he went back to his bunk, picked up Sergeant Cole's flask, and took exactly 1 mouthful of the millet spirit. It tasted like smoke and old regret. He put it back in his breast pocket, gathered his files, and went to wait at the docking port. The Endurance Absolute arrived 4 hours later. It was a heavy cruiser of the Sentinel class, long and angular, painted in the charcoal gray of deep fleet operations, its hull scarred in ways that told a story Ren would have liked to read if he'd had more time. A boarding tube extended and mated with the station's docking collar, with a clunk that Ren felt in his teeth. The officer who came through the tube first was a woman approximately his mother's age, with close-cropped silver hair and the particular stillness of someone who had learned, through long practice, that stillness was a form of authority. Her name, according to the rank tag on her collar, was Admiral Delegate Soren Vi. She was the 3rd highest-ranking xenobiological military officer in the hegemony. Ren knew this because he had looked her up the moment the ship's Sci-Fi beacon painted his terminal screen. She looked at him for a long moment before speaking. It was the kind of look that was doing work. Assessing, cataloging, cross-referencing against something internal. "You're the one who ran the 3-tier enhancement protocol on your own," she said. It wasn't a question. "I had the files. You had the files and a 6-digit code you shouldn't have had. I know about Cole." She didn't say it like an accusation. She said it like a fact she found vaguely satisfying. "Come on. I'll brief you en route." He followed her through the boarding tube and tried not to look like someone who hadn't spoken to another human being in 11 months. The briefing room of the Endurance Absolute was larger than Ren's entire station, and it was already occupied when they arrived. 7 people sat around a table that curved like a half-moon, each in front of a terminal screen. None of them were in military uniforms. Most of them looked like academics. The particular breed of academic that had learned, somewhere along the way, that they might need to run. On the central display screen floated the shape from Ren's signal capture. In the briefing room's higher resolution projection, it was clearer. Still not language. Still geometry. But now at this scale, Ren could see something he'd missed at the station. The arcs weren't interlocking by chance. They were interlocking by design. Each one was a separate piece of a structure that, assembled, would describe a complete enclosure, a sphere of some kind of organized force, perhaps, or a prison, or a covenant. Or an oath. The word arrived in his mind without invitation. He had no idea why. "Sit down, Specialist Solara," Vi said. "What you're looking at is the oldest thing any human being has ever intercepted from the void." She walked to the display and pointed at the central arc of the structure. Her finger didn't quite touch the projection, as if she was being careful not to disturb it. 14 weeks ago, our deep observation network began picking up what we initially classified as stellar interference artifacts. 6 weeks ago, you were the first analyst to identify them as non-random. You were not the only one. 7 other analysts across the network reached the same conclusion within 96 hours of you. But you were the first. She paused. That matters because of what happens first. One of the academics at the table, a man with a gray beard, and the earnest expression of someone who had been right about something important for a long time, and had recently discovered that being right was not necessarily a good thing, cleared his throat. "The pattern is a boundary marker," he said. "Or rather, it's the residue of a boundary marker. Something that was generating this signal has stopped generating it. The pattern is what remains. Like a scar where a seal used to be." Ren looked at the shape. The rib cage, the cage. "What was sealed?" he asked. No one answered immediately. The silence in the room was the particular quality of silence that happens when everyone knows the answer, and no one wants to be the first one to say it. Vi said it. "We don't know. We know that whatever structure was maintaining this boundary has been compromised. We know the compromise happened approximately 6 months ago. We know that in the 4 months since we first began detecting the residual pattern, 7-star systems along this corridor have gone dark." "Dark how?" "Dark as in, we send signals, we receive nothing." "Dark as in, navigation transmitch to 3 of those systems return data consistent with large-scale orbital disruption. Debris fields where there shouldn't be debris fields." She looked at him steadily. "Dark as in, we think something came through." The flask in his breast pocket was a small warm weight against his ribs. Run thought about Sartan Cole, already 140,000 kilometers away on the resupply drone, heading back toward a civilization that was about to discover it had neighbors. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. What they needed him to do, it turned out, was go first. He had been chosen. He came to understand over the next several hours of briefing, not primarily because of his analysis skills, not because of his xenobiological training, and not because he was the first to identify the non-random signal. He had been chosen because of something that had happened 2 years ago, in a conflict that the hegemony's official records described as the Cathara Station incident, and that everyone who had been there described as a disaster. At Cathara Station, Ren had been part of a 12-person reconnaissance team sent to investigate an abandoned alien structure, the first confirmed non-human construction found within the hegemony's expansion corridor. The structure had not been abandoned. The entity inside it had been dormant. The distinction between abandoned and dormant had turned out to be significant. 10 members of the team had died in the first contact event. One had been evacuated with injuries that ended her service. Ren had stayed. He had stayed not because he was particularly brave, and not because he had a plan, but because something in the geometry of the alien structure, its proportions, the relationship between its spaces, the way light moved through it, had felt like something he'd seen before, had felt in the specific and irrational way of deep familiarity, like something that was trying to tell him something he almost knew. He'd spent 11 hours alone in the structure before the extraction team reached him. The entity had not harmed him. He had no explanation for this that satisfied either himself or the subsequent debrief teams, and he had eventually stopped trying to construct one. The hegemony had looked at his file, looked at his psychological profile, looked at the specific quality of his 11 hours in the alien structure, and decided he was the kind of person they wanted to put in front of new things first. Hence Karath Station. Hence 11 months of watching signals that nobody expected him to decode. He had decoded them. Now they were sending him somewhere. The Endurance Absolute translated to FTL 4 hours after Ren came aboard, and emerged from translation 22 hours later on the outer halo of a system that, according to the charts, should have contained 3 inhabited worlds and an active trade station. The trade station was gone. Not destroyed. The debris field had cooled, according to sensor data, at least 6 months prior. Gone. One of the inhabited worlds remained intact. The other 2 were not. Ren stood at the viewport of the bridge and looked at what had been done to those 2 worlds, and he understood for the first time that whatever had come through the seal had been here for a long time before it announced itself. "They waited," he said quietly. Vi was standing beside him. "Yes. They came through the seal, and they didn't move immediately. They waited here and prepared, and then they acted all at once." He turned to look at her. "That's not a predator's behavior. That's a strategist's." She looked at him with something he couldn't quite read. Not surprise. More like confirmation. "That's why you're here, specialist. Most people look at that and see a disaster. You see a decision." He looked back at the void, at the cooling ghost of 2 murdered worlds, and tried to think of what kind of mind decided to wait in the dark for 6 months before moving. A patient mind. A mind that understood that timing was everything. Or a mind that was afraid of something and needed to be certain before it acted. That thought sat with him through the hours that followed, as the Endurance Absolute moved carefully through the system's debris fields. He turned it over slowly, looking at it from different angles. Something had come through a seal. Something that was large enough or organized enough to destroy 2 inhabited worlds without warning, and it had waited 6 months before doing so. What was it waiting for? Confirmation of something. Safety and absence. It had been inside a seal, a cage. Something had been keeping it contained, and the cage was broken now. And it had taken 6 months of careful observation to assure itself that whatever had built the cage was no longer present to rebuild it. It was afraid of who built the cage. He brought this theory to Vi at 22 ship time, standing in the galley because there was nowhere quieter on the ship. She listened without interrupting, which was a quality he was coming to appreciate about her. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "If you're right," she said, "then there's something it doesn't want us to know. The builders of the cage, whatever they were, whatever sealed this entity away, information about them might be leverage, or it might be a way to communicate." He heard himself say it, and recognized that it was the kind of thing people called naive right before it turned out to be true. If it waited because it was assessing threat levels, then approaching it as if we're affiliated with whoever built the cage, Could get us all killed immediately. Yes. Or it could get us something other than killed immediately. He paused. Which is more than we currently have. She looked at him for a long time, with that expression that wasn't quite surprise. You have 11 hours of sitting alone in an alien structure in your file, she said. Do you know what the psychological assessment of those 11 hours concluded? They concluded several things, he said, and most of them were wrong. The one that wasn't wrong, she said, was that you sat in there for 11 hours, not because you were frozen, and not because you were hiding. You sat there because you were listening. The entity never communicated in any detectable way. But you were listening anyway. She picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. Why? He thought about the dream, the sea that had no business being there, the roots of a tree large enough to be a world, something vast and patient waiting below. Because, he said, it seemed like the kind of thing that would have something to say. They found the first contact point 3 days later. It had positioned itself. They were already using that word, itself, which implied a singular entity, though they had no evidence yet of what they were dealing with. At the gravitational midpoint of the system's asteroid field. Not hidden, not obvious, positioned. The way you might place a marker at the entrance to a territory to indicate that the territory was claimed. The marker was approximately 4 kilometers across. It was not made of metal or stone, or any material the Endurance Absolute sensors could readily classify. It had no symmetry that the crew's analysis team could identify, and yet it was clearly organized. The same nested arc geometry that Wren had found in the signal residue, rendered here in 3-dimensional physical form. A piece of the cage placed in the middle of a stolen system, as if to say, we know what held us. Wren looked at the marker from the bridge and felt the hair along his arms rise. It's the same structure, he said, but inverted. The arcs are reversed. The gray-bearded academic, his name was Pelos, and he had been studying xenogeometry for 30 years, and now seemed both vindicated and terrified, looked at the display. Inverted how? In my signal capture the arcs enclosed something. A contained space. Wren pulled up both images side by side on the nearest terminal. In this structure, the arcs open outward. The shape is the same, but the orientation is opposite. He stared at it. It's not saying we know what held us. It's saying the thing that held us is gone. Silence. It's announcing freedom, said one of the other academics. A young woman with short dark hair and the precise controlled voice of someone translating from a language she'd only recently learned. Her name was Dr. Essa Merrick, and she was the team's lead xenolinguist. She was also, Wren had noticed, the only other person on the ship who sometimes sat alone and simply looked at the void for a while. It's a declaration, a statement of new status. Who is it making the statement to? Vi asked. No one answered. Wren turned it over. You made declarations of status to peers, to entities capable of understanding status, to whatever came after, to whoever comes next, he said, to whoever finds the open cage. It's not talking to whatever built the prison, it's talking to us. He looked at the structure hanging in the black and thought, this is where it begins. He was right. This was where it began. They established first contact protocols that evening, which mostly meant Wren was going to go outside in a pressurized exosuit and position himself within visual range of the marker, and whatever happened next was going to be improvised, because nothing in the contact protocol manual covered an entity that had destroyed 2 inhabited worlds and then left a calling card made of inverted cage geometry in an asteroid field. The academics spent 2 hours arguing about this plan. Vi ended the argument by looking at each of them in turn and saying nothing. The argument stopped. Wren suited up alone in the secondary EVA bay. He didn't ask for company, and nobody offered it, which suited him. He went through the suit check twice, methodically, the way his first EVA instructor had taught him, not fast, not slow, every seal checked in the same order every time. His first instructor had been a veteran with 1 artificial arm and the habit of humming to herself while she worked. Not any song Wren could ever identify, just a low, tuneless frequency, like she was checking that her own systems were still running. He'd picked up the habit without noticing. He was humming now as he checked the suit's life support. He put Sergeant Cole's flask in the suit's interior pocket. It had just enough room. The EVA bay vented atmosphere, and the outer lock opened, and he stepped out into the black. It was very quiet. He was attached to the ship by a tether line, but he'd set the line's tension to almost nothing. He wanted to be able to move freely, and he wanted, obscurely, to be able to make the choice to move freely. The marker was 200 meters off the ship's port side, roughly speaking. He oriented himself toward it and engaged his suit's positioning jets in a series of short burns that moved him into the marker's general proximity. Up close, the structure was stranger than it had appeared on the bridge displays. It was not solid, or rather, it was not uniformly solid. The arcs were made of something that looked, from certain angles, like condensed light rather than physical matter. Ren ran his suit's external sensors across the nearest arc and got readings that contradicted each other. Simultaneously mass-dense and mass-neutral. Simultaneously at ambient temperature and at a temperature 200 degrees warmer. As if the structure existed in a state of superposition and couldn't decide which of its properties were real. Like, he thought, something that had been inside a quantum cage for a very long time and was still figuring out how to be a thing in the ordinary universe. He held position roughly 15 meters from the nearest arc and waited. 3 minutes passed. He thought about the 11 hours at Kethara, about the specific quality of the silence in that structure, the way it had felt less like emptiness and more like attention. He'd spent 11 hours sitting with that attention, not trying to decode it, not trying to project onto it, just sitting with it the way you might sit with a person who wasn't ready to talk yet. He sat with it now. 7 minutes. The marker changed. It was a small change, almost nothing. One of the outer arcs shifted its orientation by perhaps 3 degrees, the motion so subtle that he would have missed it if he'd blinked. But he had not blinked. He had been watching. He made a decision. It was the kind of decision that would almost certainly end his career if it went wrong, and might save several hundred inhabited systems if it went right. And the math on that was not actually complicated once you thought it through. He reached into the suit's interior pocket and took out Cole's flask. He held it in front of him, in the empty space between himself and the marker. The flask was a battered thing, old aluminum, dented at the base with a small inscription scratched into the side in Cole's handwriting that read, "Also not the worst day." He held it out not as an offering and not as a weapon and not as any kind of signifier. He held it out because it was the most human thing he had on him, small and used and specific. The artifact of a particular life, not a representative of a species. The marker changed again. More arcs shifting now, and the quality of the structure's light changed. Still the same condensed light material, but warmer somehow, more amber than blue. He turned the flask so the inscription faced outward. Then he waited. What happened next was not. He would spend months afterward emphasizing to every debrief team, a communication in any conventional sense. It was not a transmission. It was not a gesture that could be cleanly decoded. What happened was that the marker, the entire 4-kilometer structure, reconfigured itself. Slowly, taking perhaps 90 seconds, the inverted cage geometry of its arcs shifted back toward the original orientation he'd found in the signal residue. Not fully, not a return to the seal, something in between. Something that looked in the 3-dimensional rendering on his suit's heads-up display like an open hand. He brought the flask back to his chest and pressed it there, the way you might press your hand to your chest in acknowledgement. The marker held its new configuration, did not move, did not advance, did not retreat. It was waiting for him to do something next. He turned back toward the Endurance Absolute, and as he did, slowly, making no sudden movements, the way you'd move in the presence of a creature you weren't sure of yet, he was aware that the marker was watching him go. Not with any sensor array or optical system that his suit could detect. Just watching. The way an intelligence watches something it has decided, provisionally, might be worth watching. He made it back to the docking ring and cycled the airlock and stood in the EVA bay while atmosphere rushed back in. And he stood very still until the environmental readout confirmed full pressure, and then he sat down on the deck with his back against the bulkhead. He was shaking. He hadn't noticed that while it was happening. He looked at Cole's flask in his hands and thought, not the worst day. The next 30 days were the strangest of Ren's life, which given his life was saying something. The entity, they still didn't have a better word, though Dr. Marek kept quietly pushing for the term, designant, on the grounds that it implied intentionality without implying singularity, and eventually it stuck, made no aggressive moves. It did not leave the asteroid field. It did not respond to conventional electromagnetic communications. But it responded, consistently, and with what seemed like deliberate precision, to Ren. Specifically, to him going outside in the EVA suit and simply being present. He began going out twice a day, morning and evening, by the ship's arbitrary timekeeping. He would position himself at the same point he'd been at during first contact, and he would wait, and the marker would do something. Reconfigure, shift its light quality, adjust the angle of its constituent arcs, and he would respond, not with language or code, but with whatever seemed honest. Sometimes he held up the flask. Sometimes he turned his body to face a particular direction. Sometimes he did nothing, just stayed, and that seemed to be its own kind of communication doctor. Merrick observed every session from the bridge and kept meticulous records. At the end of the third week, she came to him with a datapad and a look on her face that was somewhere between excitement and controlled terror, and said, "I think it's been telling us something about itself for the past 11 days. She was right. The arc configurations, mapped against each other chronologically, were telling a story. Not in sequence. The alien mind didn't appear to work in sequence, but as a kind of accumulating context, the way a painting accumulates from its component layers. Something old, something contained. Something that had been inside the cage, not because it was conquered, but because it had agreed to be. Had chosen the seal as a kind of penance, or a caution, or a patience, because whatever it had been doing before the seal, before the long dark, had cost it something it was still accounting for, and the cage had broken, not been broken. Broken, its own structural integrity failing after millennia, the way any seal eventually fails, however it was made. Ren sat with this for a long time. It wasn't imprisoned, he said finally. It imprisoned itself. That's what the data suggests, Merrick said carefully. And when the cage broke, it waited. Because it wasn't sure if whatever it was hiding from was still out there. And it destroyed the worlds in this system. He stopped, picked up his coffee, put it back down. Because those worlds showed biosignatures consistent with something it recognized. Something it was afraid of. He looked at Merrick. She met his eyes. "We don't have enough context to be certain," she said. But yes, she said. That's where the data points. He went out that evening with a question. He didn't ask it with language. He had been watching the arc configurations long enough to understand the grammar, or something close enough to grammar to be dangerous, close enough to try. He positioned his body in the orientation that the entity had used when it was describing the cage, and then he shifted the orientation, the way the entity had, to indicate inquiry, and he waited. What came back was longer than anything the entity had communicated before. He stood outside for 2 hours recording the configuration changes on his suit's cameras. And when he came back inside, he went straight to Merrick's workstation, and they spent 6 hours decoding what they could. What they could was not everything, but it was enough. Something had come before. Before the entity, before whatever it was, there had been others like it, a kind, a lineage, a blood. And that lineage had made a war. A long war against something that fed on worlds, that took the living tissue of inhabited ecosystems and used it as material for something the entity's communications described in arc configurations that Merrick rendered as propagation or flowering, depending on contextual frame. The war had been catastrophic. The lineage had been nearly destroyed. And the entity, the one remaining, the last, had made a choice. Not to run, not to hide, to wait. To hold itself in a sealed space between action and consequence, to carry the weight of what the war had cost. And to give the universe time to become something other than what the war had made it. To serve the sentence that nobody had given it except itself. Ren sat with that for a long time. He thought about Cathara Station, about the 11 hours. About the attention that had felt less like threat and more like assessment. He thought about the moment during those 11 hours when he had understood, not through any communication, but through some quality of the silence, that he was being measured, not for weakness, for something else, for whether he was the kind of thing worth speaking to. He thought about the flask. Also not the worst day. He went back outside on the morning of the 31st day. And this time he brought something in addition to the flask. He had spent the previous 2 days constructing it with the help of the Endurance Absolute's manufacturing suite, working from a concept he'd been turning over since the conversation with Merrick. It was a small object, roughly the size of his palm, made of the same alloy as the ship's hull, engraved with a pattern he had designed himself. The pattern was the arc geometry of the entity's marker, but not inverted and not in its original sealed configuration. It was the in-between configuration, the open hand, rendered small and portable and carried by a human. He held it out toward the marker. The entity was still for a long time, longer than any of the previous sessions. Then the marker moved, not its arcs, its position. For the first time in 31 days, the structure shifted its location, moving 300 meters closer to the Endurance Absolute before stopping. Ren held his ground, did not retreat, did not advance. He held the open hand out and waited. And then, slowly over the course of perhaps 40 minutes, with a precision that suggested something that had been planning this for considerably longer than 40 minutes. The entity communicated something new. The arc configurations took a shape that Marek, watching from the bridge, would later say she almost missed because it seemed too simple. A single closed arc, a circle, and then a single open arc beside it. The same shape open, a door, the same door open. Ren thought, "Oath shall remain unbroken, standing stronger than even earth and steel." He thought about how the oath had been the cage, and the cage had broken, and something had come out of the breaking that was not the catastrophe it might have been, because the thing inside the cage had had long enough to become something other than what had gone in. He pressed the engraved disc against his chest, the way he'd pressed Cole's flask. "Acknowledgement," he said, aloud, into his suit's internal recorder, knowing it would go into every debrief file and every subsequent analysis. "I think we're looking at someone who served their sentence and came out the other side." He paused. "I think we should figure out what they were sentenced for before we decide how afraid to be." It took 4 more months. 4 months of sessions at the marker, of Marek's painstaking decoding work, of late-night arguments in the briefing room between people who wanted to send a military response force and people who wanted to wait, of Ren going outside twice a day in a pressure suit and doing the only thing he knew how to do, listening, watching, being honestly present, while an intelligence that had been alone in a sealed space for longer than humanity had been building things, tried to explain what it had done and what it had cost and what it was now. The hegemony sent 3 separate authorization requests asking Vi to terminate the contact protocol and withdraw. She declined all 3, citing her field authority under the Xenic Interface Charter, and adding in the 3rd response that if they wanted to override her, they were welcome to come out here and do it themselves. They did not come. At the end of the 4 months, Dr. Marek presented the working translation matrix to the full team. It was incomplete, would probably always be incomplete, but it was enough to convey meaning in both directions with reasonable confidence. Ren went outside that afternoon and spoke to the entity through the ARC language for the first time, not responding, but initiating, asking, using the configuration that indicated the ancient war, the ancient kind, the long sentence, and asking a question he'd been holding for months. "Who built the seal?" The response was immediate and longer than any prior communication. It took Marek 3 days to decode. The seal had been built by a people, a lineage, that the entity described in terms that translated, imperfectly, as the ones who carry rain, or the cloud-bearers, or, in the most direct interpretation Marek could construct, those who came after and stayed. The seal builders were the inheritors of the old world that the war had almost destroyed. They had sealed the entity not in cruelty but in agreement, a covenant. The entity had asked for the seal, had described its own crimes, had brought the seal builders the truth of what the war had made it, and had asked to be contained until the universe grew enough context to make judgment possible. And the seal builders had honored that request, for millennia, until the seal failed. And the seal builders were gone, or changed, or somewhere beyond the reach of this corridor of space. And the entity had woken into a void that contained none of the things it had gone to sleep to escape. And it had waited, for 6 months, assessing, afraid. And then 2 worlds had shown biosignatures that the entity's ancient memory recognized. Not human biosignatures. Something older. Something that had been seeded, long ago, by the same processes that had driven the first war. A propagation flowering. A bloom of what the entity had sacrificed everything to stop. It had stopped it. The 2 worlds were dead. The propagation seeding was destroyed. Ren sat with this for a very long time. He thought about the 2 murdered worlds with their dead orbital debris fields. He thought about all the lives that had been on them. He thought about the entity in its cage, alone in the dark for uncountable years, carrying a weight it had given itself no option to put down. He thought about Dan Feng. The name arrived from nowhere, some dream place he couldn't quite locate, a name in a language he'd never spoken, attached to an image of someone who had done something unforgivable for reasons that weren't. Someone who had taken a choice away from the universe, because the universe wasn't moving fast enough, and people were dying. Someone who had then given himself up for the consequence. He went outside on the 164th day, with the engraved disc and the flask, and he positioned himself at the marker, and he used the ARC language to say something that Marek had helped him construct, and that he was not certain was wise, and that he said anyway, "We understand what you stopped. We do not understand what it cost. We would like to, The marker held still for a long time, long enough that Ren's suit began logging idle time warnings. Then the entity did something it had never done before. The marker's structure contracted, not collapsed, but pulled inward, condensed, becoming approximately half its original size. And in the space around the condensed structure, the ambient light of the asteroid field shifted. Subtly, not enough to alarm the bridge sensors. Just enough to be visible from where Ren was standing. It looked like water. Like a sea of light, suspended, hanging still in the void, the way the dream sea hung suspended over the roots of something vast and ancient. He stood in the middle of it and felt the hair on his arms rise. And understood, in the way that he sometimes understood things before he had language to explain them, that the entity was showing him something. Not explaining, showing. The way you might show someone a scar instead of describing it. The direct thing, the thing that required presence rather than translation. The propagation had been a seeding program, an alien ecology of consumption, a living system that spread between worlds and used their biospheres as substrate for its own growth. Not out of malice, but out of a biology that was in some fundamental sense incompatible with any other biology existing near it. The entity and its kind had been the ones who stood against it, had fought the war, had survived the war in a state that was, after the war, no longer compatible with the universe's peace. And so the entity had chosen the cage. Not conquered, not punished, chosen. Ren stood in the light sea and understood that he was looking at the aftermath of something that had no human equivalent, not exactly. A grief too large for individual experience. A guilt that had outlived the context of its origin. A patience that had made something unendurable that should not have been endurable. He pressed the engraved disc to his chest. Acknowledgement. He pressed Cole's flask to his chest beside it. The human thing, small and specific. Also not the worst day, he said aloud, to himself and to the recording, and to whatever listening might span the distance between his voice and the entity's awareness. I hear you. The light sea held for 30 seconds. Then it faded. The marker returned to its full size. Ren went back inside and filed a report that was 47 pages long and that he prefaced with the following note. This is not a threat assessment. This is a first meeting. Treat it accordingly. He did not know if anyone would. In the months and years that followed, some people did. The entity, the Designen Doctor. Marek's terminology, which eventually made it into official hegemony records, did not leave the asteroid field for 2 years. It did not move against any human worlds. It did not respond to any communications except those conducted by Ren, in person, through the Arc language that he and Marek spent those 2 years refining into something that could carry nuance in both directions. He learned that the entity was not alone, was not precisely singular. The word it used for itself included a concept of lineage, of accumulated selves, the way a river includes all the water that has ever moved through it. What had gone into the cage and what came out were continuous but not identical. The cage had been a process, not a stasis. He learned that the propagation had not been fully destroyed, that it existed still, in dormant seedings distributed across a volume of space that would take lifetimes to map, that the entity, the lineage, had knowledge of those seedings, preserved across the long dark. He learned that the 2 destroyed worlds had been a tragedy, and had been, in the entity's judgment, necessary. He did not tell it, he disagreed. He held the disagreement separately, gave it its own weight, kept it from contaminating the work. He learned that the entity had a name, had many names, accumulated across its long existence, and that the one it offered him translated, as closely as Marek could render it, as rain that remembers where it came from. He told the entity his name, Ren Solara. It spent 3 days rendering the sounds through the Arc language's tonal components, and when it had them, it incorporated them into a configuration that meant, as best as Ren and Marek could determine, the one who stays and listens. He took that as a compliment. 3 years after first contact, the Hegemony Admiralty Council authorized formal negotiations. Ren was not the negotiator. That role went to a diplomat with a staff of 40. But he was present for every session, sitting at the far end of the table in a role the official records called xenocultural liaison, and that everyone present understood to mean the reason this is possible. On the last day of the formal negotiation sessions, after the accords had been initialed, and the crisis, which most of the known worlds hadn't known was a crisis, had been resolved into something with the tentative shape of an alliance, the entity did something unprecedented. It sent a direct communication, not through Ren, not through the Arc language of the marker. A pulse of structured signal, transmitted on the hegemony's own communication frequencies, addressed to the Endurance Absolute, and coded specifically for Ren's terminal. Dr. Merrick decoded it in 2 hours. The message was simple. It contained the ARC configuration of the open hand, the in-between configuration, neither sealed nor inverted. And embedded in the center of the configuration, rendered in the entity's language, was something that Marek translated first as an oath that holds his, and then revised to a covenant that has room in it, and eventually settled on as, "There is space here for both of us." Ren read the translation 3 times. He picked up Cole's flask from his desk. He'd transferred it back to his pocket the moment he'd come back aboard the ship, 3 years ago, and it had been in his desk since. And he held it for a moment, turning it in his fingers, feeling the dent at the base and the scratch of the inscription under his thumb. Also not the worst day, he set the flask on the desk and pulled out his terminal and typed his response in plain text, which Merrick would translate into ARC language for transmission. "We accept. The covenant holds. We are here," he sent it. He sat back and looked at the viewport and the black beyond it, and the faint light of the entity's marker, steady in the asteroid field, holding its configuration of the open hand. In his dream, the one that started always the same way, he was standing at the edge of a sea that had no business being there. The water hung still and green gold, and beneath it, in the cathedral dark between roots larger than worlds, something vast and patient was present. Not waiting, just present. He stood at the edge of the sea and understood, as he sometimes understood things before he had language for them, that the water wasn't going to stay still forever, that it would move again, and that the movement was not a threat, that what mattered was not the moment of stillness, but what had been learned during it. He stood at the edge and was not afraid. The dream never ended there. It opened outward into something he couldn't quite see, not a darkness but an expanse, the particular quality of space that isn't empty but occupied by what hasn't arrived yet. He always woke up before he could see it clearly. He thought that was probably fine. There would be more mornings.